Welcome or welcome back to Scouting Stuff. You've just got me this week, Scouter Ken, and, well, it's actually been a while since I've posted any Scouting Stuff episodes whatsoever, or even Scouting 5 episodes. And I think it's time for a rethink of how I do the podcast. I mean, I like doing the Scouting 5 news segments. I also like doing the main episodes, where we dive into and talk about different subjects. But sometimes it's hard to line up time to actually get on the microphone, to get on a Teams call, to get on a Discord call, or whatever, or to get out in person, to actually sit down with someone and have a discussion. But I'm still here, and I still have the microphone, and there's still stuff to talk about. So I think, going forward, I'm going to restructure the podcast a little bit, and it's going to incorporate now a few different segments. Basically, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and put the news together with the discussion, and maybe the discussion will be about the news, and maybe it'll be something completely unrelated. That will probably vary episode to episode. For this one, to inaugurate things, the discussion, which is just going to be me offering some random thoughts, is very much going to be related to the news articles that I cite. The other thing that I want to introduce, though, is a segment on gear. And that's actually what I'm going to start with today. Understand that I'm not putting this out there as anything other than a comment on pieces of kit that I have found particularly useful in my own scouting career. I'm not offering this as an endorsement, and I'm definitely not getting paid for any of these promotions. I'm just talking about things that I've used in the past, or that I found really handy, or that I make sure I always have in my backpack whenever I'm heading out. And the first thing I want to talk about is my Lucy light. Now, if you've never seen a Lucy light, that's L-U-C-I. It's made by a company called BioLite, B-I-O-L-I-T-E. And the Lucy light is essentially an inflatable solar lantern, solar LED lantern. When you first buy it, it's basically just a little flat disc. It's got a solar panel on one side and then kind of a mess of plastic on the other side. And the idea is basically that, there's an LED light panel on that other side, not the same side as the solar panel. But that mess of plastic is basically an inflatable, slightly frosted plastic. It's very like a beach ball in terms of the material that comprises it. And in fact, you inflate it the same way you would inflate a beach ball. So you just pop open the little valve, blow into it until the Lucy light is fully inflated. It only takes a few breaths. And then you have your little cylindrical lantern, which will float, by the way, being filled with air, and point the solar panels at the sun. And then, by the time nighttime comes around, you'll have this lovely little lantern that you can just click on. It has 2 or 3 settings. There's a constant on, maybe 2 or 3 brightness settings, little constant on. I think there's a blinking SOS feature as well. Lucy lights now come in a variety of colors and features. I'll throw a link in the show notes. But again, I'm not saying this, because it's a paid promotion, and I'm not saying this is an endorsement per se. I'm just saying this is a particularly useful piece of kit that I always travel with because it's light. It only needs sunlight to work. It works in almost any condition, and it packs down into this thin little disc, right? You let all the air out and squish it down and throw it in your backpack, and you don't even notice it's there. And now for some scouting news. The 29th Interamerican Scout Conference wrapped up just recently. It was held from the 30th of October to the 2nd of November in Willemstad, Curacao. And one of the big focuses on it actually seemed to be the role of women in scouting. Quoting scout.org. The 29th Interamerican Scout Conference was held from the 30th of October to the 2nd of November, with Scouting Antiano proudly hosting the event. This vibrant gathering of leaders, volunteers, and youth representatives marked a significant moment for the Interamerican Scout region as it introduced the Regional Triennial Plan for 2025 to 2028, and a series of resolutions that will guide the movement toward transformative growth and lasting impact. A highlight of the conference was the election of the Interamerican Scout Committee for the 2025 to 2028 period. The new committee has a notably strong female majority with 5 women and 3 men elected as voting members, reflecting substantial progress for gender diversity in the region's governance systems. Delegates also selected the National Scout organizations to host regional events over the coming triennium, ensuring continuing collaboration and engagement. End quote. Actually, advancing female participation and leadership was a huge part of the conference. And especially there was a large focus on advancing women's leadership. It sounds a little bit strange to talk about this in the context of like North America, because, I mean, at least, where I have been doing scouting for a while, like when I was in Scouts, sure, there were only boys in the group, even though it was post-1997 when Scouts Canada had gone fully co-ed. Nowadays, I mean, obviously I have 3 daughters, 2 of whom are still in scouting. They're both venturers. My son is a cub. There's quite a number of other young women in the venturer company. And, we see a fair number of female cubs and beavers, scouts. But in some of the Interamerica regions, attitudes towards women do vary from what we've kind of come to expect as, the baseline here in like Canada. So you still see stuff like this coming up as an important issue that these scouting committees and regional committees and NSOs want to advance and improve upon. And that's great. But that also brings up another bit of news, which, if you've been following news out of the United States, you may be aware that Scouting America has recently expressed its displeasure at what is reported to be a memo from U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, which ostensibly proposes to cut ties between the U.S. military and Scouting America over the fact that it is, how best to put this, no longer a boy-friendly space. Quoting NPR, "The century-old partnership between the U.S. military and Scouting could be coming to an end. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is planning for the military to sever all ties with Scouting America, saying the group once known as the Boy Scouts is no longer a meritocracy and has become an organization designed to attack boy-friendly spaces, according to documents reviewed by NPR. In a draft memo to Congress, which sources shared with NPR but which has not yet been sent, Hegseth criticizes Scouting for being genderless and for promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. The military has provided support to the Scouts for more than 100 years, assistance that was formalized in 1937. But in one memo, Hegseth says, the organization once endorsed by President Theodore Roosevelt no longer supports the future of American boys. The proposal calls for the Pentagon to no longer provide medical and logistical aid to the National Jamboree, which brings in as many as 20,000 Scouts to a remote site in West Virginia. It also states that the military will no longer allow Scout troops to meet at military installations in the U.S. and abroad, where many bases have active Scout programs." End quote. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast long enough, you know that I have 3 daughters, 2 of whom are still involved in scouting. They're both venturer scouts. And I also have a son. He's a Cub Scout. My other daughter was a Cub Scout. She decided it wasn't for her, so she's out of the program now. And that's fine. You also know, if you've been listening long enough, that I'm Canadian. Canada has had fully co-ed scouting since 1997, so since I was a venturer. So, in a way, it certainly doesn't strike me as strange at all to have girls and boys doing scouting together. And, in fact, I kind of like it that way, because I really wouldn't want my girls to have gone into Girl Guides. Mainly because my options for participating alongside them as their father would have been severely limited. Although, also, having gotten a sense for at least how the guide troops in my area run program, I don't think my girls would have been a particularly big fan of that organization. There are some really great guide troops that I've met over the years that do all sorts of wonderful, outdoorsy, adventurous things. I just don't happen to live near any of them, it seems. So while I disagree with Secretary Hegseth's views here, at least as have been reported by NPR, and I will say that I don't always trust that, the reportage is accurate, but let's take it at face value. I disagree with the idea necessarily that scouting has to be completely boy-focused. I mean, obviously my scouting context has been quote-unquote genderless for, that's the weird thing. Because even though scouting in Canada went fully co-ed in 1997, my group, or at least the levels of the group that I was in, the sections that I was in 1997 and onward, were fully male. We had female scouters, but it was just me and the other boys that were enrolled in venturers and then in rovers. And obviously, we would have come up through beavers and cubs and scouts when the program was focused mainly on boys. Female membership in Scouts and Cubs was kind of being piloted prior to 1997, but never in any way that touched the 59th. And while this didn't really occur to me when my daughters started going to Scouts, now that I see my son moving through Cubs, and now that I will have a son to raise, he's the youngest of 4 kids, in reflecting on my own time in scouting, there was something about it being a boys-only program, as I experienced it, mainly, though not exclusively, but mainly led by the fathers of many of those boys, there was something in that I think was developmentally beneficial for me. And it's probably telling that most of my lasting friendships came out of scouting, guys that I have been in scouts with since Cubs, Beavers, Scouts. And I got to thinking about rites of passage. Actually, it's been kind of weird. I listen to a lot of like parenting and psychology-focused podcasts, and this is something that's come up again and again when the topics of the episodes have shifted towards how boys are doing today. Because it turns out boys are not doing great today. If you look at things like high school graduation rates, high school marks, in the mid-1990s, the overall high school completion rate, these are U.S. statistics, but whatever, for 18 to 24-year-olds in the U.S. was about 86%. Modest gender differences at that time. By around 2016, completion rose to about 93%, although women, girls, were starting to edge ahead, 94 versus 92%. State-level data tells a little bit of a different tale. Starting from about 2018, girls start to develop more of an edge when it comes to high school graduation and on-time graduation, so not taking extra years to make up credits. 2018 data says 88% for girls versus about 82% for boys. Similarly, girls have seen growth in their high school GPAs or their high school overall marks. A gap of about, let's see here, 3.0 versus 2.68, again in favor of girls. Although more recent studies suggest that the female students now graduate high school with roughly a 3.1. Boys may have narrowed the gap to 2.9, but again, they seem to be falling behind. It's a weird kind of pattern because while overall high school completion rates for both boys and girls have risen since, 1990 and before, boys' completion rates, on-time completion rates, and overall marks, represented by GPA, peaked and then have started to decline. They're still finishing school at a higher rate than they were before, but they're taking longer to do it and they're coming out with lower marks compared to girls, which is being reflected in university and college admission rates. These have skewed very heavily in favor of women since, at least since the early 2000s. I mean, Canadian statistics would suggest that female participation in university courses actually began to exceed men's in about the late 1970s, although the real widening of the gap there actually started in kind of the 1990s, early 2000s. Currently, the best statistics I can find suggest that men receive only about 42% of bachelor's degrees. That's as of around 2020, which roughly aligns with about the male composition of your average post-secondary body, 42% versus 58% female. And a little bit of a darker note here, but if you look at things like suicide rates, deaths of despair, so overdoses, alcohol-related deaths, things like that, male rates for all of these are typically 2 to 5 times higher than female rates. And that's around the world. There was a time when those rates declined. That was kind of starting in the 90s into the early 2000s, but then started climbing again. And in some countries have even exceeded previous peaks. And while there's been a lot of research into why this is, nothing seems to be conclusive. Although loneliness, lacking friends, a lot of these things are they're well-known contributors to suicide, to deaths of despair. And I think in some way, those rates are in a way related to, the fact that men do seem to be now struggling in education, their participation and success rates in education declining as time goes on. And I can't help but wonder if maybe somehow we're just not doing enough anymore to form successful young men. I got thinking yesterday about rites of passage. It seems, and I didn't really go digging into the data on this, but it seems to me that, whether we're talking about your first hunt and your first kill in some ancient tribal society or a bar mitzvah for a Jewish youth, there's a lot of almost every really culture historically and into what we would call modernity has developed these rites of passage. It's the term we would know them as, that involve older men mentoring younger boys in something, whether it's a particular set of skills and responsibilities that will benefit the tribe, whether it's the meaning and teaching of a particular set of beliefs. It's this well-established framework throughout human history of the older men of a group training up the younger boys in the group, and then through some ceremonial rite, commissioning them to now go out and do the things that they have learned and the things that they have been taught and the things that they have been given responsibility over. And yes, I mean, obviously, over those many centuries, there's a lot of this that's been caught up in what we would now call abuse and hazing and toxic masculinity and all the rest of it. But this is such a prevalent thing, and it has been throughout all of human history. And even acknowledging the negative elements to it, I can't help but wonder if maybe, like at some core evolutionary level, at some core level of like the design of human beings, I can't help but wonder if maybe like that whole experience is critical in some way to the healthy psychological, social, moral development of boys. I haven't gone digging into the data for that too much. That would probably be an interesting research topic. And actually, this would probably be a great topic to like talk about with somebody else, because right now it's just me talking into the microphone. I think I'm going to have to revisit this subject at some point in the future. But I can't help but wonder if we've lost that somewhat in society, and at least in Canadian society, North American society, and if that won't prove to be a detriment in the near future, or if it isn't already proving to be a detriment now. And I'm not saying that scouting needs to be it. If you listen to enough episodes, you've probably heard me say this before, that I completely understand the need for a boys-only space, just as I can appreciate the need for a girls-only space. I don't know that scouting is it, but I can see that there's a need for it. But if I rack my brain, there's not a lot of like boys-only spaces that I can think of that exist, apart from like sports teams, right? Sports teams, okay, there's like boys hockey, girls baseball, girls baseball, at least above a certain age. Most of those leagues, they can do like co-ed for the little kids and then they split off at some point. And that's fine if you have kids who like sports. I have one kid who really likes sports. My one daughter does. And the others are kind of take it or leave it on it, including my son. He likes playing baseball, but it's mostly just a chance to get out in the field and throw stuff and hit stuff, right? It's not like he's passionate about the sport in and of itself. It's just the physical activity. And the teams at that level, even though they are boys teams, the teams are pretty transient from year to year. There's not a lot of consistency in the rosters. You don't really see the same kids year over year, play with them year over year. Not like in a scout troop. And if I think about like other things in the community, right, whether it's like the art studio that my daughter takes classes at, I mean, they have girls only classes for, teenage girls, and then they have just teens classes open to boys and girls. There's not a boys class. If I think about like the youth groups at our local parish, it's mostly just, co-ed, anybody can show up. They do have a few girls only evenings that they do. Again, not really anything boys only. Off the top of my head, at least thinking in my local area, I can't really think of any organization that is not sporting and just for boys. And that's not to say that it's a bad thing that there are all these other non-sporting opportunities just for girls. Girls-only spaces are important too, absolutely. And so are mixed spaces, right? It's not psychologically healthy to just be in a boys-only context or in a girls-only context. These need to balance each other out. You need to be able to work with members of the other sex and also have formation opportunities in single-sex environments. And I get that. But off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything non-sporting in my area that my son could do. And that worries me a little bit because obviously I had that growing up inadvertently. That's just kind of how the membership shook out with the scout troop and the venturer company and the rover crew that I was part of. But I can see the benefit that it had for me, and I worry my son won't have that. And again, I'm not saying that scouting is what that should be. The scouting maybe doesn't necessarily need to be the context where that can happen for him, but it would be nice if there was something. So while I don't agree with what Defense Secretary Hegseth's stance here is, at least as reported by NPR, at some level, I can kind of understand what might be going through his mind, at least in part. Because I do worry about this for my own son and for boys just in general. We're not really doing okay. And I don't know what the solution to that is. The other segment I wanted to introduce is survival tips. So when you're going hiking, and especially at this time of year, it's very important to make sure that you have all of the proper equipment that you need to be out and about in the wilderness. Unfortunately, for some hikers in Vancouver, they learned this lesson the hard way. But fortunately, there was a cub pack on hand to help them out. Quoting CTV News, "A weekend camping trip at Golden Ears Provincial Park turned into an unexpected rescue effort for a group of Pitt Meadows Scouts after they came across 3 stranded hikers cut off by rising water. The Scouts, part of the 1st Pitt Meadows troop, were hiking when leaders noticed 3 people calling for help from the opposite side of a creek swollen by heavy rain. With the hikers unable to cross, the group, which included 13 youth, moved as close as they safely could and passed over food, thermal blankets, and hand warmers. We gathered some rations from the kids, tied it to a rock with blankets and hot paws, just whatever we had," said the group's Akela, Luke Lunnan. They were extremely ill-prepared. Running shoes, cotton clothes, fleece pants. I believe one had pajama bottoms. Unprepared hikers are commonly seen by search and rescue teams around the province of British Columbia. End quote. So really, yes, be ready for the weather. A, check the weather. That's the first survival tip. Check the weather before your excursion. And then B, understand the area that you're going into and the potential challenges that the weather might present. Pack extra clothing, pack extra food, pack proper rain gear, wear proper footwear that can keep the water out if it's going to rain. This was in British Columbia, so in the wintertime, that part of British Columbia tends not to get a lot of snow, but they do get a lot of rain. And so you will see things like creeks really suddenly escaping their usual banks, swelling as water comes crashing down the mountains after a heavy rain. And unfortunately, you do get a lot of tourists in the area all year round. You get a lot of people who are new or newer to Canada and don't necessarily understand the challenges that our climate presents. And it's a beautiful part of the country. People naturally want to go explore, but all of these factors can combine to create situations where you get people who, as in the story here, are completely ill-prepared to actually go and experience the wilderness safely and in a way that will allow them to stay warm, stay safe, get home again safely. And search and rescue teams are pretty busy in British Columbia pretty much year-round, but notably at this time of year. So luckily for these particular 3 stranded hikers, the Cub Scouts were on hand to pass them what supplies they could, help them stay a little bit warm and give them a little bit of energy, while the search teams, evidently already engaged, were making their way up to the area. But that is the survival tip for you for this episode. Check your weather ahead and dress for it. That's it for this week and this year. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. I'll see you in 2026 with a hopefully successful, hopefully more frequent revised format. And until then, be prepared.